Very delighted that you could join us today. My name is Rick Edlund. I'm the Communications Director here at the Show Me Institute. I was telling Dr. Williams just a little while ago, a month or so ago, you couldn't look at the newspaper, you couldn't turn on the television, you couldn't do anything like that without seeing the school transfer story all over the place. And now that's quieted down, but these issues are certainly not going away anytime soon. So it's still a critical issue and one that we have some feelings about, and we wanted to share the feelings of the men who are in the front lines of the situation and have firsthand experience. So what I'm going to do is ask our panelists to each give a brief overview of the situation, where we stand now, perhaps where they think we are headed, and then we can open it up. I will ask a few questions, you all can ask a few questions, and we'll get a dialogue going. I would ask you to try and keep the questions relatively brief and have them questions and not statements, as we don't have a great deal of time. This is something obviously we could spend all day discussing. But in any case, let me introduce our panelists. To my immediate left, we have Dr. Tyrone McNichols, who is the superintendent, as you know, of Normandy School District. Dr. Eric Knost is the superintendent with Mehlville School District. And Dr. Thomas Williams, is the superintendent with Kirkwood. We have our own doctor on board here, James Shuls, Dr. James Shuls, who is our education analyst here at the Show Me Institute. So let's get underway and find out where we stand right now and where we're going from the future. Dr. McNichols, would you care to start, please?
Sure. Just kind of where we are. About a month and a half ago, or 2 months actually, we found out that we had to participate in the transfer program. Being the new superintendent, starting officially July 1, we had to make some quick decisions. The first decision, which I think all of us participated in, was how is this process going to be facilitated? There was no guidelines to how that was going to work, and so through CSD we were fortunate enough to have Don Sintes and his organization willing to facilitate that process. So the cooperating school districts all came together and put together a comprehensive plan of action of how to do the registration, as well as the forms and the timelines in which we would try to meet the decision that was put forward. And so between, the middle of June until August 1st, our district, being Normandy, one of the sending districts, spent the majority of time trying to verify and document the residency of every single student who wanted to transfer out. After August 1st, my colleagues here took on the role of trying to figure out how to place or enroll all of those. Well, they didn't place them. Through the process of CSD, every single student's first, second, or third request was processed. Those who got their first, second, and third were able to go ahead and register at the appropriate district. Those who didn't, there was a second round in which they had to go through and pick up fourth, fifth, sixth, and in some cases, seventh choices for some children. And so from that, that's been pretty much the process as far as the transfer. As far as our district, the impact, we have 1,100 students, or a little over 1,100 students who actually applied for the process. As of last week, we had about 160 who have already come back for various reasons. Because of the way the case is set up, our district is required to pay the tuition rate of the receiving districts. There is no standard cost, even though we get about $12,000, or we spend about $12,000 per student. We're required to pay whatever the cost of the difference is in those districts. So, for example, at one extreme, at $19,000, you got Clayton, we have to pay $19,000. So that's $7,000 that comes out of my budget on top of what I receive for every single kid. And so that's where we are in this process. We're trying to figure out how we're going to pay $1.5 million per month to the various districts that are participating in the transfer program. We have started off with about $8 million in reserves, and we had a $50 million budget in which we had originally planned for 4,000 kids before the transfer program was announced and before we took the move to follow the law.
Okay, we've got some follow-up questions, obviously. I'm sure I have, and the audience has as well. But let's get Dr. Knost, your thoughts at this point.
Good morning. For me and for the Mehlville School District, July 9th, about 1:15 was when we were brought into the fold. Obviously, the weeks prior, all of us as superintendents had prepared for potential amounts of transfers because of the Supreme Court's decision. July 9th was when I found out that we were selected as a transportation district. Was not part of that decision, which it's not set up for the receiving school to be a part of that decision. Spent the following weeks identifying how we could help through the CSD process. That was a joint effort of all of the local school districts. To kind of fast forward, we have accepted actually well better than 216 students, which was our allotted seats, if you will, that we identified as our availability. And we accepted more because we knew that we probably wouldn't get all of our students, and that's kind of been it ebbs and flows, but we've landed right at about that 216 mark, and we're continuing to try to work through some transportation issues of kids that have to get up really, really early in the morning, sometimes be transported from their home to a place for a bus to pick them up and bring them to our district. The students are doing very well. They've been welcomed into our school district. You can't walk through our schools and determine who is a Riverview student or who is a Mehlville resident. You really don't, there's no way to notice that. Our students have welcomed their new friends with open arms, and in that regard, we're doing just fine.
Dr. Williams.
Well, we found out, we knew all summer that the Supreme Court was going to probably make a ruling, and so in anticipation of that, and for the last couple years, we had talked about what might be the outcome of that kind of decision. And so our board and I had discussed trying to put in place some reasonable rules, because there were no really rules or procedures for the transfer process. We tried a couple years ago, the stream Turner fix was proposed, kind of bannered around the legislature, a lot of special interest attached, little special kinds of things to that bill, and it ended up going nowhere. And then because it was being litigated again, everybody kind of just sat on waiting for the decision to be made. But we had talked about we felt we needed to have some reasonable rules that we could follow, that if challenged could be supported just by the fact that we felt they were board adopted, locally reviewed and approved, and reasonable. And so when that Supreme Court ruling came about, we moved forward with trying to get some reasonable rules in place. At that time, we didn't know we were going to be a district that was going to be bused to. So up until about the 1st of August, we knew that Mehlville had been selected, and up to that point, there was probably 30 or 40 applications to Kirkwood, and we knew we could handle that pretty reasonably. And all along we said we really need to make a good faith effort to try to follow the law and the Supreme Court decision. Well, once we became a destination for busing, then the numbers jumped up to over 200. And again, we thought, we have to have some rules based on our class sizes, and we have to identify spaces that we could justify, that we could defend if somebody challenged us in court or just came to our school board meeting. So we went through and identified how many slots we had, and we were about 185 to 200. And we ended up, we have 181 students attending from Riverview Gardens and 4 from Normandy. We had been involved with the BTS program for 25 years, and so accepting non-resident students wasn't really, it wasn't a huge issue for us, other than making sure we could fit them within our class size guidelines. We didn't want to have to hire a lot of extra staff. Our enrollment in the last 5 years has gone up 10%. I've been in Kirkwood 5 years. I moved from Iowa, and I have 30 years in Iowa in education, and this is my 30th year as a superintendent. I know I don't look that old, but so we had choice in Iowa. We had open enrollment. It's structured a little differently, so having students have choice wasn't new, I guess, to me. My philosophy had always been, choice is good. Let's just be the best choice, and then you don't have to worry about it. But the transfer and Missouri's formula for funding, everything is a lot different than it was in Iowa. So it's not an equal. It's not comparing apples to apples when you try to compare them. And Ty made a good point as far as how he has to pay tuition if it's to Clayton, $12,000 or $19,000. If it's to Kirkwood, it's $12,000, and the state aid is different for every district. And so anyway, we really had a good start. I mean, I think we had a lot of little issues to work out, but if you add our transfer students and our VTS kids together, we have less total than we did 5 or 6 years ago. So we're still at about 450 kids if you add those two groups together. Now, if we had 500 more transfer kids, it would have created a lot of problems for us. We are at capacity in all of our buildings. Our enrollment when I came was 5,100. We're at 5,600 right now. So our enrollment has gone up 10% just from resident enrollment and non-resident together. So we're really at capacity. We're going to have to probably add some more classrooms sometime in the future. But so I think it's manageable if there's reasonable rules. You got to protect the resident district and the sending district, and so there needs to be. The state board came up with some reasonable rules to follow, which I think helped everybody manage this transfer issue. It does not address at all the 4,500 or the 10,000 kids that are still left in Riverview Gardens in Normandy. So the real focus in my mind needs to be on how do we provide them with the resources and support they need to get their schools accredited so their parents and their families don't have to think about putting a child on a bus for 30 miles for them to get a quality education. They ought to be able to do that in their own neighborhood. And what do we need to do to make that happen? That's what I think. So.
James?
So, like many of you, I watched this case unfold this summer and last spring, and with a lot of great interest. And probably like many of you, I was a great armchair quarterback. Whenever DESE released guidelines, I could complain and criticize about them, and whenever Normandy would make a decision, I could complain and criticize them, and whenever Mehlville put in some caps, I could complain or criticize them, and lots of us were able to sit back and watch the situation and criticize or do whatever we do best as armchair quarterbacks. We weren't in the position that these guys were in, and so they really were in a tough situation. They were dealt a tough hand of cards. And I really appreciate them being here today. I really appreciate that they are looking forward, that their districts are, I think, all trying to do what's best for kids. And sometimes we come at that with a bit of a different mindset. We think we know what's best, and we look at things from a different perspective. We're at a free market think tank here, and I look at things oftentimes from a free market perspective. And it was mentioned a few minutes ago that a few years ago, we had proposed the Turner Fix. And I want to explain a little bit about what that was and why I think the Turner Fix might still be a good solution. It might help some of the concerns that were brought up here. We have really three parties here that are of interest. We have the sending school districts, the receiving school districts, and the students. We want to be concerned about all of those, and we want a policy that's going to address and help all of those students, or all of those parties, I mean. So how do we do that, and how does the Turner Fix help? So the Turner Fix was a tax credit scholarship program. And the way this works is individuals and corporations give money to a private scholarship organization, and that organization gives scholarships to students. Now, you might say, well, how does this help the sending district? Well, as we heard, the tuition costs can be outrageous, paying $19,000 to Clayton is a lot of money, especially when the district is only spending $12,000 themselves, and Riverview Gardens even less than that. Well, in a tax credit scholarship situation, when a student would leave, the district would lose the state and the federal dollars, but they would retain all of their local dollars. So they wouldn't be out as much in tuition costs. They wouldn't have as much of a financial burden there. The receiving districts, especially Francis Howell and the ones that have had students busted them, had a lot of students come in, and that can be overwhelming. It could push them to their class sizes to capacity, could really stretch those districts. Well, when students have more choice, they have greater options, a greater number of places to go, and it spreads out the number of students. There are plenty of private schools throughout the area that could take on a few of these students and ease some of the burden of those receiving districts. And then the students, I think, benefit because they get even more choices. I'm one that tends to believe that we all benefit when we have choices. Whenever we get to choose to go to one place over another, the place that's going to best meet our needs. And so I think that a program like this would be something that helps everyone. Now, sure, in a school choice program, the districts are going to lose some students. That's happening now. But we asked, how can we set up a choice system in the best way to meet the needs of all the parties involved? And I think a tax credit scholarship program is part of that. I think allowing the districts to put reasonable limits in place for how many students they'll accept is a very good place to start. I think there are lots of ways we can work together looking forward and create a system that's going to benefit all students and not put the districts in really as tough of a financial spot as they are in right now.
Well, I'd like to start it off by one observation and then a question for Dr. McNichols. You mentioned, James just mentioned the financial situation. How do we save the kids from the sending districts like yours? You mentioned that you have, I believe, correct me if I'm misquoting you, you had $8 million in reserves. I have read that this is going to cost you and Riverview Gardens roughly $30 million, or it could cost $30 million. How can you afford this? How can you survive this? How can you save these kids in your district?
I'm glad you asked that, because that's not been really the conversation out there about what we're going to do for the 75% that have stayed. All the conversations out there have been around the 25% who have chosen to leave, and what are we going to do for them? So I appreciate that question, because that is my biggest concern. We're not getting the same amount of money to educate the 75% because we're paying the off difference of what those other districts' tuitions are. So in a sense, my kids, not just are we losing $15 potentially $1 million, it's they're getting less money to educate the 75% because we're paying the difference for the 25% to go somewhere else. The scholarship model would work if that's all we paid, because it would be really a flow through. We would just take the money we get from the state and the feds and send it to those schools. That would be great, but that's not what's happening. So we have to figure out how many staff members we're going to have to consider reducing in the next couple of weeks. We've got to look at what programs are prioritized and that we have to keep and not keep. And at the same time, we also have to create higher standards and expectations and try to meet accreditation. So what we're saying is poor districts or struggling districts need more resources, but we're going to take most of your resources and ask you to do more with less and get better. That's basically what we're saying to them.
Easy.
Yeah. And so what we have to do is prioritize. I know it's going to be difficult. I knew it was going to be difficult when I came in because the district was unaccredited, but the transfer program wasn't there. So we're optimistic that we've got the right team, that we got the ideals that we think will help us make progress towards the accreditation process, specifically as it relates to the achievement of the academic side. However, the resource piece puts us in a situation that if we do nothing, we can be bankrupt by March if we do nothing. But we are going to do some things. We are going to reduce staff. We are going to cut programs. I mean, our team actually started that process yesterday. We will continue for the next couple of weeks. We'll be working with the Normandy NEA so that everyone is aware of what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, who's going to be impacted, what programs we're going to keep and which ones we're not. And that's just to see if we can get close to $15 million. Now, the reality of it is we're not going to be able to cut $15 million. I mean, that would be like 80% of everything we do. Because what we don't talk about in this is 70% of our budget is staff. The rest of it is not staff. So the only way to get close to $15 million is to cut staff. And so when I listen to people talk about, well, we'll let kids go to a charter-like school, that's great. I think the cheapest district in this area pays about $9,000 per kid. And I heard someone say a couple weeks ago, well, the charter schools can do it for $5,000. Really? How? I mean, because the other piece of what we don't talk about is there's lights, there's electricity, there's water. All of that has to be paid as well. So when we think about a school, sometimes we just think about, well, they just need to get better and teach better. Yeah, I agree with that. But there's the other side of what we call running the actual buildings. The buildings themselves have to be able to function. And so is there air conditioning? I mean, it's 100 degrees today. If I don't have air conditioning, do I close school? I mean, those are the things that people aren't thinking about when they ask me questions like, what are you going to do? Everything I have to do has to be around the academic side. We've got to get better at teaching. We've got to have higher expectations. More of our kids have to read better than they are. That's a given. But we can't do that if we're going to take 15 million and do less and expect more and expect it to be done before February. Because the reason I say before February is this process starts over in February. So a whole slew of families can decide, oh, I'm decided now I want to transfer out to the other schools in February. Well, the MAC test and the end of course doesn't even start until March. So how are we going to know if we made progress for our families before we start asking them if they want to leave or stay? So those are just some of the things that we have to deal with.
So can I put,
That sounds a little overwhelming.
scenario.
Yes, go ahead.
That's one scenario I heard was that you will run out of money by March. The kids will be taken, Rittner will have to take them over. Rittner won't pay the bill to the school systems. And then there was a big question mark. Have you heard anything like that?
Well, if the state is planning on giving them to Rittner when we run out of money, then my question to the state is, why are we waiting till March? Why didn't we do it now?
So if they run out of money in March though, and they're not gonna keep you if you don't pay the bill,
I get 2 months.
you get 2 months extra?
Really?
You get 2 months extra.
I get 2 months before the state starts to take my money and pay them directly.
It sounds like a very difficult catch-22.
The reality is that for years we've taken less than the actual tuition to run the VTS program. Kirkwood, we get $7,000 per student, but we take the kids and put them where we have space. So in reality, the cash flows pretty well. There isn't any additional overhead because we're putting a third grader in a class with 19 and it makes it 20 and we don't have to add a teacher. So if we can control where we place kids, we could do it for less money, and I would support having an across the board amount designated so that there isn't a difference. Now, people will disagree because they're saying our local property tax dollars are subsidizing that student's education. We shouldn't do that, but it's worked for 25 years with the VTS program, and I think it could work with the transfer program as well, and help districts like Normandy and Riverview Gardens not have to pay a huge tax bill and keep it so that everybody pays the same amount for every student in St. Louis County.
No, I think, again, we're even guilty of this. It's real easy to turn this conversation right back to how you afford to send students someplace else. And Ty's point of the absolute, every student had a choice. Every student had a choice. CSD worked to give every single student that wanted a choice, to give them a choice. But the vast majority of students, both in Normandy and Riverview Gardens, stayed there. And you know, there's no voice out there. There's never been a voice for these children and these families that like the ones that call me. I had calls from Riverview Gardens residents saying, you know, by participating in this, you're depleting our resources, you're sending jobs away from our community, you're taking our pride and joy, our students. So there's perspectives And we can understand all of them. If we're smart, we can anyway. If you're a parent and you don't like the situation your child's in, then to that person's perspective, a choice somewhere else, how can you argue that? But when you look at the greater good and what we're doing for these large percentages of students that want their community, the schools are the heartbeat of any community. And how you fix a school, I don't, and I have great respect for Ty, but I don't know how you do that when you're allowing your community to deplete resources, to deplete jobs, to deplete what often turns out to be some of the higher performing students that are there as role models to help lift other students up. So.
We do have a question here, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on a number of the comments. Can we agree, whether you're liberal or conservative or whatever, this is an absolutely insane law and it is crazy to support. There is nothing to prevent the entire 4,000 student body of Normandy and 6,000 student body at Riverview tomorrow demanding entry into the Clayton School District, 2,500 students, or Kirkwood. And essentially, Clayton or Kirkwood would have to take them, and if not, they're subject to a lawsuit. So the question then becomes, if we can agree that this is a crazy law, what do you see as the prospect for trying to combine some of these various Mr. Shuls ideas and other ideas into legislation that would in fact remove this insane law?
Well,
May I start? Sure. I would say the spirit of the law is not insane. So the spirit is that we have students in a district that's been chronically underperforming. The students they've been in a failing district for quite a while, and we want those students to have options. So the spirit of that, I don't think is insane. I think we all want kids to have good options. Now, the question is this the best way to do it? And I think that you're right, the law, and as we've discussed, puts a really financial hardship on Normandy and Riverview Gardens and those sending districts. If they go to Clayton and they have to pay more for tuition than they themselves get, that puts them at a disadvantage. But choice itself is not a bad thing. Choice itself is a very good thing. I've seen, I've been reading newspaper accounts and seen interviews with Dr. McNichols. I've seen very great things coming out of Normandy and Riverview Gardens where they're trying to make changes to really attract and keep those students. And I think that's one of the things this program does, is it makes districts, as Dr. Williams was saying, say, okay, we have choice, let's be the best choice. And so the districts start finding ways to improve. Now,
with all due respect, how do you expect Mr. McNichols to actually survive?
No, you're right. No, you're right. And what I'm saying is the spirit of the law and choice itself are not bad. But when you do it and you put the district at a disadvantage where they're spending more than they get themselves, it's untenable. And so putting in place, I think, limits for the districts to say, look, we don't have enough spaces for every student. I mean, even charter schools in St. Louis can say, I have 100 spots, we're going to have a lottery for those spots. They put in caps in the number of students they're going to accept. So the districts, receiving districts, should be able to control a little bit the number of students they're receiving. And if we worked out an equal tuition rate, I think that we could make this a program that is tenable and doesn't put the district at a disadvantage. But I'll let someone else go.
A couple of things. When you talk about the importance of choice, once again, we flipped it right back to the smaller percentage that want a choice to leave. Where's the voice for the choice to stay? Where's the voice that protects the people that want to build their community, want to make an effort at making something that attracts and retains the interest in that local school, which needs to be the heartbeat of any community. So you're right, and as I said earlier, there's perspectives we have to consider on choices, but you have to consider all perspectives. We can't continue to focus on one concept, one choice. And the other thing too that I think we have to be careful of, in some of this conversation we've kind of intermixed some language about private schools. That opens up a whole additional can of worms that you think it's a mess to figure out the Supreme Court's ruling or the law that the Supreme Court interpreted. Add to it when money flows through and students are now going to private schools. Do private schools, are they now subject to the rigorous standards that we're subject to, the testing and all of those things that make accreditation in a public school. And maybe it's the other way. We'd probably all jump up and down and say, hey, we'll take choice if it means we get to forego all those things that are handed upon us from the state. So again, there has to be a voice, and I plead with folks all the time. We have to consider the individual communities, and you can consider Normandy before Tide, before any of this. They absorbed the Wellston School District. So where does this domino effect stop? And when do we start admitting? A lot of times, you know, the quote's out there. Many people have said this, but if you 9 out of 10 times look at a flourishing economy in that community, and you'll see a successful school. 9 out of 10 times, that's going to be the case, and that can be challenged, and it can be proven if you just look around. So,
is there any way that you can get the legislature to make it more fair? I mean, I can't understand 19,000, 12,000. That doesn't make any sense.
Listen, thank you for asking that. Here's the commitment we need to ask from our legislators. When they go about fixing this, here's been the problem in the past. They won't deal with this in isolation. I've said this in many interviews, and sometimes it gets aired, sometimes it doesn't. We need to challenge our representatives to deal with this in isolation, because it becomes a political football, and immediately this special interest gets added to this. And well, you know, if we've got all these superintendents agreeing on this, well, then let's make them do this other thing over here that this special interest group is interested in. The end product, no matter who's right, is it doesn't go anywhere. Nobody votes for it because it's too much of a mess, too much of a political mess. So it needs to be dealt with in isolation.
City is just like Washington, you're saying.
The other issue I have, thinking about, let's see what my phrase I was going to think. Suppose you equalize it and everybody's at 13 or 14,000. Doesn't that really hurt someone like Clayton as far as their program?
That's Iowa, right?
Well, I mean, it depends. If you limit the number of kids you have to take and allow the receiving district to place kids where you have vacancies or slots, then it reduces your additional costs considerably. It reduces your overhead. You cash flow it pretty well. We've done it with the VTS program for years, and that's how we do it. We get a list of applications in early December. We match them up with where we have openings in January. We place them in February, and March 1st we know where all those kids are and where they're going. And we can do it for less than our actual tuition because of that. And you know, this could probably work the same way, but I agree with Eric that as you expand choice, you know, it can't be unconstitutional. If you have charter schools or anybody else receiving state funding, they have to be held to the same standards as local school districts. They have to accept all students, and they have to be tested, and they have to be accountable. I mean, that would have to be part of the whole.
James, you want to say
issue.
something? We've got
You know,
several people.
I mean, when it comes to transferring to another district, what we're talking about is the marginal cost of an empty seat. So you have, like he was saying, you have 19 students in a class, you have one seat that's open. You can either leave that seat open, or you can get an additional $7,000 or $8,000. And so it's beneficial for receiving districts to take in a few extra students to fill up those seats. Now, when Dr. Knost was saying, some people like in the legislature like to add in special other things to this type of bill or this type of piece of legislation. I imagine that he's considering a private school choice program in that other stuff that's added on, but I see that a private school choice plan as part of the solution. Just as I was saying, it helps out all three parties. And if it's a tax credit scholarship program, there's a good chance that it's not going to be in violation of the Constitution. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that tax credit scholarship programs aren't actually state dollars because the dollars never flow into state coffers. They flow to a private organization that gives out scholarships. Individuals then receive tax credits for those, This is very different from a development tax credit, which the Show Me Institute regularly opposes. I'm happy to explain the difference later. So I think that it could be part of the solution, not something different that's added on.
Okay, sir, you've been waiting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. When they say it's not about the money, it's about the money. Let's face it, the state of Missouri is a no-show. The average state supports 46% of the cost of education. Missouri was at 39, they dropped it now 31. They were down as low as 29. When they did Wellston, when they controlled Wellston, they were spending about $14,000 a student. At the end, the math scores were at 11 and the English scores were at 9. And they washed their hands, gave it to you guys. Your funding has gone down $500 by over the last 2 years per student. It's about the money, you know, and unless the state of Missouri comes to the table and starts to fund the schools the way they should, we're not going to ever get this, because I used to run a plant right across the street back of Al Salvage in Normandy. That's actually in Wellston, but across from Normandy High. So we've got to look at the funding issue.
But may I say something real quick? Carl and I regularly disagree. I think we do have a problem with funding, and I recognize, and we all recognize, that the funding formula has been underfunded. But I really quickly want to correct something. When you talk about the percent that the state funds, when they look at those comparisons, they rank one state to another, they're counting apples to oranges. So Arkansas regularly ranks very high in state funding for education. Arkansas counts part of the local property taxes as state dollars, okay? In Missouri, we count the 1% sales tax as local dollars. So we shouldn't talk about the percent of state funds. What we should talk about is how much we actually fund education. If we start with those, if we start there, we can have a really good discussion.
Right. We are $1,100 below national average. How about that? That would be,
so we can start at a much better place there.
We would have to raise $1.1 billion just to bring us up to average. How does that work for you?
Well, we're going to have a separate debate on this. We'll have a whole different policy breakfast on that. He's had his hand up. Go ahead, sir.
If I'm understanding correctly, under the current law, it requires the sending district to pay the amount that's allotted. Short-term solution question, and completely short-term, can the receiving school district choose to refund the difference?
If the boards of those
They
districts
could,
are
but
willing to.
Will they?
we won't.
Well, we have, I'm the wrong one to ask, because probably one of the reasons we were selected, we have one of the lowest per pupil expenditures in St. Louis County. So we won't be refunding anything, because that's not going to benefit us.
We get $500 per student from the state. 92% of our total funding is local property taxes. So for us, we typically we're a hold harmless district. So even with $2 million in new tuition, we're probably going to run a deficit this next year.
What's that mean, Tom? Hold on.
That means that our state aid is held at a very low number because we have more local support. So, for example, we get about $500 per student in state aid based on the formula. Normandy, what do you guys get?
About $7,000.
They get $7,000 per student.
Because they're on the formula.
Because they're on the formula. So the cycle of our spending is to build up a fund balance by asking for a tax increase of our local property owners, build that fund balance up, and then over about 5 years spend it down until you're into a deficit, and then ask the voters to increase their taxes again. And that's based that for hold harmless districts, that's how you have to fund your budget. And so right now we're in a declining fund balance, and every year we're spending it down. So to refund it, it would just mean we would run out of money faster. So it wouldn't work for us to return money, but if the state had a different formula for transfer students, then we'd have to accept that.
So this is an overriding concern, and possibly, obviously we care deeply about the kids and about the students, but the overriding concern that I'm hearing here is money.
Well, I agree with Eric, though. We keep turning the issue back to the kids that are leaving and the funding when we should be. What's the solution for Normandy to make sure that they are a viable school district, that they have a district that's accredited for Riverview Gardens? What do we need to do to make sure their communities are
What do you think?
vibrant?
Solution for that?
You know, there's no silver bullet, but Eric, I mean, I'm waiting to hear some of your suggestions because there isn't a perfect answer, I don't think.
This gentleman in the white shirt, yes.
James, I wanted to understand more about your funding formula that seems to be relying on private and corporate dollars. How do you ensure what you're talking about is a steady flow of income that districts can depend upon from year to year? What's the motivation for these donations that you're talking about?
So a number of other states have a tax credit program like this, and they haven't had any trouble attracting donors. And the way the tax credit works is, say I give $1,000 to the scholarship organization.
Why?
For one, corporations have an incentive to give away donations, and the other thing is that you do get a credit, and it's different from a rebate, or it's different from a deduction in your taxes. So it's not that you're reducing your tax liability or your income by $1,000. What you're doing when you give that $1,000, if there's a 75% credit, you get $750 towards your taxes. So the individual has an incentive to give because they do get a tax credit. Now they're still going to be paying more than they would otherwise, but individuals and corporations tend to like helping kids. And so the scholarship programs haven't had any problem attracting funds. And in every time that they've done one of these programs, there's usually a study that goes along with on the finances. And they show that the states actually come out ahead. They don't lose money in this type of tax credit scholarship program because more dollars are flowing into the system, and students are then using the privately funded scholarships to go to private schools. The state tends to benefit. Mike Podgorski here has a paper from the Show Me Institute that analyzed a proposed tax credit scholarship a few years ago and shows that it could save the state millions, possibly millions of dollars, depending on how it was implemented.
Dr. McNichols.
I'm not opposed or against the opportunity for kids to have choices. My question to those types of statements is, I went to CBC. CBC is going to cost you $15,000 to go. So what kind of money then will kids from Normandy have an opportunity to go to CBC if they're getting a tax credit? I mean, Normandy is going to give them 12.
Here's a bigger question though, Ty, and James, maybe you can answer this. If that goes into place, which of course, let's keep in mind, the whole spirit of our conversation is about students from unaccredited districts that are primarily, there's a lot of poverty within, there are students that are underperforming. When a student from Riverview Gardens, regardless of who they are or what their academic level is, wants to take that money and go to CBC, is CBC going to let them in?
Well, probably.
But besides that, not even beyond that, let me go back. What you've done, if you've got a family of 3, is you force that parent to have to make a choice. Say she has 3 sons, but CBC's $15,000, and we only give them 7. She has to sacrifice 2 of her children's choices for one child to go to CBC.
Sidwell Friends.
So what do you do with those other 2 children? Where do they go?
Sidwell Friends, where the president's children go to school, accepts voucher students from the Washington, D.C. Opportunity Scholarship Program. Very prestigious private schools accept students all the time. What we're talking about again
They
is
have to be able to do the work. I taught at Sidwell Friends for 7 years. They have to be able to do the work, and that's the question.
So what we're talking about again is the marginal cost of an available seat. I surveyed.
Keep talking about that, but we shouldn't be. We should be talking about the students.
Well, absolutely, and I think choice gives those students another option. But will CBC, which might have high tuition, I don't know the tuition rate of all the schools, accept one of these students? I think they probably will. They would accept a good number of students to fill up available spaces.
I set parameters in place because I had to, and I was blasted by the armchair quarterbacks, James, as you referred to them as, who because of a comment made by our enrollment, didn't understand the landscape, didn't understand the fact that our actual elementary enrollment today compared to 10 years ago is 150 more than it was. The landscape in our high schools, the number of sections of courses, we had about 160 something 10 years ago. We have over 250 sections of different AP courses we've expanded. Those take spaces to teach. We have over 18 teachers pushing carts who don't have classrooms. None of that mattered. I was blasted because I put parameters in place, and I want to know, when that day comes, that hands down, if the same critics are going to go after the private schools the first time they say no to one kid because academically they're not where they need to be to succeed in that private school. And I disagree with anybody in this room that says that private schools are going to hands down open their doors and take every kid that comes under. It's not going to happen, folks, and we're in la la land if we think that.
Can we talk about solutions?
Well, yeah, okay, so here's, for this number on the Catholic schools, we're cherry picking. The average tuition in Catholic schools in the St. Louis metro area is way below $15,000, okay? And there are a lot of Catholic schools that will take kids in way below that. There's a tremendous capacity in the Catholic school sector and the Lutheran schools too. So this number is way too high.
Disagreeing voice.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My wife taught in Ferguson, Florida. She had 24 out of 28 kids, not at grade level. I talked to the lady who is the assistant superintendent for the archdiocese, and I asked her directly about taking those students, and she admitted that she couldn't take all of those students. She admitted that they only took the mildly to moderately handicapped kids. They don't take the homeless. They throw out all the disruptive students. And don't say that they don't, Dr. Bunkerski. You've been wrong so many times I can't even.
Well, let's run the experiment. Let's find out. Okay, let's open this up and begin to see how many get accepted and how many don't.
And I want to do what you want to do here. We've only got, like I said, we could be here all day and have a worthwhile discussion.
I've got time.
They don't have districts to run.
Can't we go beyond?
Just a second, please. I would like to wrap this up because we only have a few minutes left. I would like to wrap this up by asking for solutions. You wanted to talk about that, and
So
short-term and long-term, and I realize there's no silver bullet, but what's your best guess? What needs to be done?
So this is the approach that we're taking as a district. Part of our situation is MSIP 5, and I'm not here to debate if it's good or bad. We can do that all day as well. There's, I call an MSIP game. There are points associated with the accreditation piece. There are some things we need to do as a district to get better. So the short-term version of it is we've got, and we've looked at the numbers. We need to get 3% improvement in our academic areas, in the 4 core areas that are assessed. 3%. If we get a 3% improvement, we will get about 6 to 9 points on the academic. Right now, we've been getting 0 points in the academics because we've been below the threshold of 300. And so we've been on, like, the last couple of years, knocking at the door, but not actually crossing that threshold. So when you see that 0, people will assume that none of your kids are doing well. That's not true. Not enough of our kids are doing well to get it out of what is defined as the floor. So the short term is to play what I call the MSIP game. We've got to get the achievement. This is not about cheating or anything. This is about focus on reading and literacy, so that most of our kids are above grade level or at grade level of reading. So we've got to get more of our kids out of the below basic into the basic. And simply by doing that, you go from getting 1 point to 3 points. And so those points add up. So that's the short version of what we have to do in regards to the academic side. We've got to increase our graduation rate. Our attendance actually went up this year. We just got to maintain what we did in the attendance. One of the things, there are a couple of aspects of MSIP 5 as far as the career college ready piece that hurts transient districts. One of the things that we have to do is follow up 6 months after kids graduates to find where they are. Well, that's great if I have a stable community and people don't move. But when I have a district where maybe 20 to 30% of the families are moving in and out, that's difficult sometimes to maintain. but that's part of the accreditation process. So it's things like that we have to do. The dropout rate hurts us because we have kids who might be in a district for 6 months and come with us for 2 weeks, never come back, don't know where they are. They're defined as a dropout on us. In a highly transient district like that, that happens. So there are things we have to do as a district to put some systems in place. That's the short term. The long term is we've got to make sure that our curriculum is viable, and it is. We've got kids who've gone to Ivy League schools, so it's not the curriculum in and of itself that's preventing it. It's not enough kids who are being successful on it. So we've got to get more kids involved in the AP track. We've got to get more kids who are coming out of 8th grade taking geometry as a freshman. Most of our kids are coming out of 8th grade taking algebra. And we consider it in debate if it's a quality school or not. The real issue is curriculum alignment in a lot of things. Kids are not going to get a 32 on the ACT or ACT unless they're taking calculus. They're just not. And if most of our kids are on track to take pre-calc because it's just the way our alignment, they're not going to have ACT scores above 21 and 22 on average. That's just not going to happen. So the long-term game is we've got to make sure our kids are on those tracks that will put them in those higher AP track classes. There are other things that we don't talk about that also impact our schools that have nothing to do with teachers, that has to do with our community resources, our parent resources. My kids go to one of those schools that we talk about, and my kid was struggling. I put my kid in Sylvan. I've worked in a very affluent district that's close to here, and a lot of those families put their kids in Kumon and Sylvan. My families don't have the resources to do that, to offset what might be not effective instruction. But those families have the resources to do that. We don't have those conversations. We assume that every teacher is a great teacher in all those schools. That's not true. I can tell you from personal experience. There are a lot of good teachers, but not every single kid is learning in those environments. And so how do you offset that? We don't have the resources to send our kids to Sylvan, but that might be something that will help. If Sylvan, I'm just using Sylvan as an example, if Sylvan has a track of getting 70% of the kids to be able to grow in 2 years, then why isn't all of these schools like mine being given resources from the state to put them in Sylvan? I mean, we talk about, are we committed to the kids? That would be a question that I would have. Now, I know there will be others that say, well, why should we give that kind of money to a struggling district? Those families whose kids are in those affluent districts, families are sending them there. Now, some of them are sending them there, not because it's bad. They want them to be ahead of everyone, too. So you've got both of those games going on. That's the long and short game that has to happen. For me, as a new superintendent in a district that just lost its accreditation in January, I need time. I mean, people are asking me as if it should be fixed already. We've only started school in 3 weeks. And we have systems in place already that we're seeing positive comments from the community, from the students, from the staff. Kids are committed. The kids who come back have said, we've come back to prove those people wrong that Normandy is a good district and that we are committed to Normandy. That's what kids are saying to us. There are kids who are saying they don't want to go, but their parents want them to go. And I don't fault parents, I get that. But that's what's going on right here. We've got kids who are committed. We've got teachers now that are motivated, that 2 years ago they felt burnt out, they were ready to go, they wanted to quit, they hated the community. Now I'm hearing different voices about people excited about the opportunity. That's how it has to change. But that's not going to happen in 3 months. It's not going to happen in 9 months. It's going to take 2 years to change that culture and turn those strategies and those practices around. But if the resources are depleted before I can get there, then it's a useless act and action to move forward. And that's why I said what I said earlier. If the state's intent is to take our district and simply place it in another district at the end of the year because we run out of money, why didn't they just do it now? Quit wasting all these people's time. We could have not worried about the transfer program. Just put us in another district and everybody else just move forward.
You talk about kids and parents being committed. Obviously, you're very committed, so we appreciate that.
At least Monday through Thursday. I'm just kidding.
We've only got a couple of minutes left.
Couple of minutes, I'll be quick, but I do want to say as a superintendent, formerly assistant superintendent, former principal, former assistant principal, all in the public setting, but in receipt of a whole lot of students that show up on our doorstep saying they were asked to not come back to the private school. So that's reality. That was a outstanding technical explanation on Ty's part, and I'm going to pick up on another angle that he mentioned at the end, and that was the part about passion and about kids kind of finding that spark inside their school district. Everybody in this room can help, especially the media. Get inside that district, find those things that are sparking the kids, their interest, start highlighting those things, start giving the kids something to be proud of. You will see a turnaround in any community, in any school, quicker than anything that we've talked about today. It's about relationships. Every single kid has to have a connection to their school, has to have a connection to the adults. They have to have champions picking up their cause and finding those things that make those kids proud. And that's the way you build up a community, build it on relationships. You cannot fix a community by depleting their resources, which is what the surface level discussion continues to talk about. We've got to talk about how we help Ty build up his community for those kids, the vast majority of them that want a community school. They want to stay, they want to grow up. A lot of the parents want their kids to graduate from the school they graduated from. They live there now. That happens in our community, it happens in Tom's community, it happens in all of our communities. Relationships, we have to capitalize on that alongside of Ty's technical explanation of MSEP 5 and going along with that. And we have to afford some patience in this process.
And I agree with Eric. Some people say, well, Kirkwood should go to Riverview Gardens and run one of their elementary schools. I cannot take the culture of Kirkwood and take it to Riverview Gardens. Culture is extremely important, and it's unique to that community. So I have a few bullet points that I think that could get them started in that direction. First, just the language has to change. Unaccredited district, I think it has a mindset that is very negative. I like to think, okay, they're unaccredited. Now they're in a transition period. They're a transition district. How do we make that transition back to where they're accredited? I think buildings should be accredited, not districts. Yes. So there are buildings within those districts that are good schools, and they're accredited, and we ought to promote that and talk about that a little more. I think there needs to be a transition team put in place in those districts. There may already be. I know the superintendent has to be really involved with that transition team. And they have to have broad powers. They have to override union rules. They have to override whatever they need to do to get the job done, put the right people in the right place, get the right people on the bus. They need broad discretion to be able to do that. I think they need to have small incremental benchmarks so that they can see the light at the end of the tunnel. MSIP 5 can be overwhelming. They have to have smaller, reachable benchmarks that get them moving in the right direction, so that just starts moving them there quickly. And then I think you have to look at some kind of economic stimulus for their community to make it more vibrant and economically deal with poverty, unemployment, all those kinds of things that make a community better if you can address them. So
James said at the end, so we can get the last word, I'm sure, but keep it brief, please.
Sure, absolutely. So, I agree with a lot of what has been said up here by the superintendents, and I do appreciate them being here, and I appreciate the work that they're doing. I think it's important for us to remember when we talk about revitalizing a community and turning around a community, it's not the same as revitalizing a district. I think that we can revitalize the community and not have to solely focus on Normandy, not solely focus on school districts. I think districts, the way that we have them structured and the way that we've segregated ourselves, are part of what has caused the problem. And don't get me wrong, I'm not calling for a big suburban school district or anything like that. But what I'm calling for is, let's get past the mindset of what is public education, that it's not about a district, it's about educating kids. And what's the best way to do that? That is the district, that's the traditional public schools, it's in bringing in charter schools, it's incorporating private schools to serve students. And I think that when we think about public education as really meeting the needs of kids, we could start moving in a direction where we would stop thinking as much about revitalizing a single district and think about policies that are going to give all students an option to go to the school that's going to best meet their needs.
And I think we need to do this again sometime. So I wanted to remind you, thank you all very much. Thank you so much for taking your time, because you were all wonderful, and I know you're extremely busy these days. And I wanted to remind you about the fundraiser we got coming up on September 27th. Flyer is right out here on the table. Please grab one on your way out the door. Thank you very much for attending today. It's been a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure meeting you.
Nice to meet you.